we've seen ever since. Israel has often had huge challenges, whether it's the United Nations. In those days, it was the Cold War, so Israel was an ally of the United States, and therefore the Soviet bloc was going to be anti-Israel anyway. Nowadays, I think things have changed a bit. It's Iran is the country that is most anti-Israel, and there are some other countries in the world that are critical of Israel. Although Israel's international standing, I think, has increased by massive leaps and bounds since 1980.
منذ 40 عاماً قامت إسرائيل بعملية قصف لمفاعل أوزيراك العراقي النووي، خطوة غير مسبوقة وغارة لم تحدث من قبل، وصفت بسابقة تاريخية. يشار إلى أوزيراك كمثال للهجمة الوقائية في البحث المعاصر الخاص بالقانون الدولي.
And from Israel's point of view, this would have posed perhaps an existential threat, because Saddam Hussein was very much anti-Israel, and in fact, the Iranians had tried to destroy the reactor, and Saddam Hussein had intimated that, this is not being built to fight just Iran. This is going to be used against Israel. We'll develop nuclear weapons. So Israel decided that they had to go on a daring mission using F-15s and F-16s that they had just acquired.
هجوم إسرائيل على المفاعل النووي الإيراني لم يكن الأول من نوعه، لكنهم ربما قاموا بهجوم أقوى وأخطر، وكان الأول من نوعه في المنطقة وربما تاريخياً حينما تم تدمير مفاعل أوزيراك.
I think it's the first time, obviously, in history that anyone had ever attacked a nuclear reactor. It was not a reactor that was yet operating. It was not yet hot. So there was no danger that would be like a Chernobyl type of event. But I think that Israel had done, of course, very daring raids before. It had gone all the way to Africa to save hostages. But this was a really different type of raid, and it showed that whether or not the international community, the United States or others, were urging caution, that Israel would go it alone. And I think the doctrine that was laid down 40 years ago is a doctrine that Israel today continues to say, that if it is threatened, especially an existential threat, it's willing to do whatever is necessary to defend the state of Israel and its people, whether or not other countries advise caution or say, please don't do that.
عملية إسرائيل على مفاعل أوزيراك جاءت بعد محاولة من إيران لتفجير المفاعل، لكنها سببت ضرراً طفيفاً قبل عام من العملية أوبرا. قام تقنيون فرنسيون بإصلاح الأضرار بعد ذلك سريعاً، قبل أن تقرر إسرائيل ضرب المفاعل وتأسيس ما عرف بعد ذلك بمبدأ بيغن، وهو ما يعني أن الضربة على مفاعل أوزيراك ليست محض صدفة أو استثناء، لكنها سابقة لأي شيء قد يحدث في المستقبل ولأي حكومة تأتي بعد ذلك لقيادة إسرائيل.
The idea is that not only was it very complex training that had to take place, but they had to fly over Saudi Arabia right next to the border of Jordan. And in fact, I think they flew over a royal yacht on the way to get there when they went down through close to Aqaba. So they had to fly over Saudi Arabia, and those days, of course, Saudi Arabia and Israel did not have good relations, and they had to fly apparently around 100 or 150 feet off the desert landscape. So, I mean, I've never flown an F-16, but I can't imagine it's very easy to fly within 100 feet, which is just, if you had trees or something, or if you had some sand dunes that you might hit it. So they had to go over all that landscape. They had to fly, south of Baghdad. They had to find the reactor. They had to drop all of their bombs precisely, 16 bombs on the reactor, to make sure that it's not just dinging it, but totally destroying it, maximum destruction. And then they had to fly back. And that means that any issues that they face, for instance, air defense, if they triggered radar or surface-to-air missiles or things like that, they would have had to fly back through all that. And the question is, what happens if one of the planes goes down? How do they get the pilot out? So I think that the fact that it was a kind of precise mission, apparently totally flawless, shows, the capabilities, and also that they were willing to risk it all.
بعض الدراسات المعاصرة للقانون الدولي تشير إلى أن تدمير مفاعل أوزيراك العراقي هو مثال لضربة وقائية، ويناقش المؤرخون دوما مدى فعالية الهجوم. فهل يتكرر الأمر ذاته مع إيران ومفاعلها النووي؟
I think Israel accepted the fact that they will be criticized. I mean, Israel basically is always criticized for defending itself. Whether or not Israel does wrong or does good, it's always being criticized. Whether it's the Hamas firing 4,000 rockets this last month, and Israel trying to do a precision war against that. Well, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's 40 years ago, and I think that we have seen, momentous changes in the region. Many countries in the region today take Israel very seriously. There is no belief, I think, among most countries that Israel can be defeated in a conventional war. That's why we see, for instance, Iran's threats to Israel or all of its speeches in the Iranian regime. It's mostly speeches and bragging. What Iran transfers missiles and drones and things. I think that 40 years after that raid, we can see that the military superiority that Israel was willing and able to put down and the risks it was willing to take showed what the country was capable of. And we're seeing the fruits of that today, because Israel is a country that is respected in the region. It's a country that is now making peace with partners in the Gulf and other countries. So clearly, I think, many countries are starting to see that Israel can be an ally, or at least a partner in certain things. Even if Israel doesn't get along, or maybe there are certain issues, the Palestinian issue, what have you, countries may not get along, but there are shared interests, and Israel can be part of that regional worldview, as opposed to, I think, 40 or 50 years ago, when we look at Israel and we see a country that was much more isolated, in which many people said, well, this country can be defeated and driven into the sea or whatever. And obviously that has not happened. Israel is a high-tech powerhouse. It's a phenomenally successful and relatively wealthy country.